ones. But really quickly, when I talk about that stuff, when I say remind you all to that there are mental health services via the Cal State LA Student Health Center, it's just a reminder, because a lot of times, especially the upperclassmen, tend to forget that those services are available. So even if you don't require any of that right now, it's good to remember that those services are available. You've already paid for them when you pay your tuition and fees and all of that. And it's might be a good way to try things out if it's something that you're new to. The other thing I need to say is I've graded everyone's papers, at least every paper that was submitted. I'm accepting all late work this semester. So it's still in, for anybody that might have missed submitting it, it's still in your best interest to submit it, because it's a significant chunk of your grade. It's 20% of your grade in. So turning in something, even if it's not perfect, is better than not turning in nothing, right? It's better than a zero. So I am accepting all late work. Yeah. So those of you that might have missed one or two or even more of the discussion board posts, I will still accept those. At the end of the semester, I will have a cutoff date for any late work. So I don't want people to leave it all to like the end either. So you don't want to get too far behind, right? My suggestion for anybody who gets really behind, and I think this is mostly for people who are probably not in the Zoom today, but it is to first pick up this week, start this week, and then you can work on catching up, because otherwise it gets overwhelming when you have more than 2 or 3 discussion board posts to complete. It can be a lot. And it feels overwhelming if you're just looking at all the missing assignments. But this is also a good time to come meet with me if you're worried about your grade, if you're worried about any aspect of the class. I have office hours immediately after our class on both Monday and Wednesday, but I'm also happy to meet at a different time on Tuesday, Thursday, or Friday. My schedule is relatively flexible. So usually what I tell students is, hey, send me an email if you want to meet, or stay after class also. And give me some days and times that work for you. And usually I can find something that works with both of our schedules. All right, let's see. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, because this week we have a lot to talk about this week. Sometimes when you're trying to cover all of like American history in one semester, even though it's 16 weeks, it's still a lot of material to pack in, right? So for week 12, we were discussing the civil rights movement. You have a couple of readings to do. The more important one is the one for Wednesday, Malcolm X's The Ballot or the Bullet. Especially if you've never read any Malcolm X, I highly, highly recommend you read it. He's very readable. He's very direct. He's not an academic, but he's talking about really important topics. So we'll get to him on Wednesday. But today we need to start the civil rights movement. And when we talk about the civil rights movement, we tend to talk about it, one, as if it just popped up out of nowhere in the 1960s, but it didn't, right? It has really decades and decades of work of activists trying to end segregation, especially in the American South. Now, there was segregation pretty much everywhere in the country. A lot of people still point out we still live in a very segregated United States. The difference is that at the time, from the period of Reconstruction up until the Civil Rights Movement, you had legal segregation in large chunks of the American South, right, where states had passed laws that legally prohibited Black people from using the same seats, the same facilities, the same doors, the same doctors, the same hospitals as white people. So everything was separated: schools, health facilities, even like if you went to the store, if you went into a department store at the time, right? You wouldn't be able to maybe enter the same doors, use the same bathrooms, use the same seats as white customers. this even existed in places in California, where if you were not white and culturally, even though legally Latinos counted as white, culturally, the Latinos also would not be able to use some of the same facilities. So this existed everywhere, but with the legal aspect, especially in the South. The American South also had a long history from the period of Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement of lynchings, right? The case of Emmett Till was in the 1950s. Have all of you who, I'm like, raise your hand if you've heard of the Emmett Till case. Oh wait, I was like, wait, nobody? Okay, a couple. Oh, okay. I'm actually surprised not more people are raising their hands. So maybe I will spend a minute here talking about Emmett Till, because two of the or some of the big things that begin changing, even though people have been fighting the segregation and the violence against Black communities and other communities, non-white communities, was that nothing was changing. Right. At this point, white communities had completely monopolized the voting system. So politically, it was very hard to change anything when white people were voting as a bloc to prevent any kind of changes to segregation. And so, and when Black people were being prevented from even registering to vote, right? So it becomes very difficult to change anything. But after the world wars, things really begin to change. One, people became back, men came back from having fought abroad with the idea of, wait a minute, I just went and fought for freedom. Why don't I have that at home? Right? So they begin joining organizations like the NAACP and other local organizations that were actively trying to fight legal restrictions, especially on Black people and other non-white communities. So then there were specific incidences like the murder of Emmett Till. So he was a young boy. Let me bring up a picture of him, actually, since I hadn't planned on talking about him, but I think it's important enough that we should talk about him. So he was 14 years old. He was from the Chicago area, and he was visiting family in the South. He was visiting family in the South, walking with friends, and a white woman accused him of whistling at her. She accused him of whistling at her, went home and told her family that this kid had whistled at her. So several white men got together, went and pulled this 14-year-old boy out of his family's home and killed him. They lynched him. A few days later, his body was found. His family back in Chicago came to collect his body, and they had a funeral, but it got a lot of attention at the time. It became symbolic of the kind of extra legal violence that the Black community faced on a daily basis. Just this was normal, that especially Black men were being lynched, were being killed for minor infractions. Things like whistling at a white woman, kissing a white woman, being seen with looking at somebody the wrong way. The community took it on their hands. Sometimes people would be arrested, accused of having done something illegal, but then the community would go and collect people from the jails, and law enforcement allowed it to happen. And then they, without trial, without any kind of due process, would just kill people. After World War II, there were Black veterans who were lynched. And so it highlighted even more than ever the inequality that existed in the United States. Akia, was that your hand raised to add something or ask a question, or was it left over? Okay, I think it was just left up for asking people to do that. So the case got a lot of attention because it highlighted, how unfair things were. Like, here's this kid who was accused of whistling at a white woman, and that's why he ends up dead, right? And so the unfairness of it then brought people then to join organizations like the NAACP, but the NAACP was fighting segregation legally in courtrooms, right? People wanted to do more. So the figure we primarily associate with the civil rights movement is Martin Luther King Jr. Right? We celebrate him every year on several occasions. So you were all taught about Martin Luther King Jr. at some point or the other. So tell me, what do you know about him? Bless you.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So what do you all know about Martin Luther King Jr.?
I'm sorry.
You're good.
He was religious, educated in Baptist church. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
He studied in college.
yeah. We end up actually, I'm like, we've kind of made Martin Luther King Jr. into a really important figure, but most of us don't really study him in a meaningful way. And actually, a lot of us in my civil rights class, the history of the civil rights movement. So we've been looking at this for the whole semester. But so he was born in Atlanta, Georgia. He comes from a well-to-do Black family in Atlanta. Right, so he would have been considered, his family would have been considered middle class. His father and his grandfather were very proud of the fact that their families were never hungry. They could always provide for the family. This afforded them more opportunities. So for example, Martin Luther King Jr. ends up being able to go to college, right? He goes to a historically Black college because at the time colleges and universities were not integrated. And then ends up going to graduate school in Boston, which is where he meets his wife, Coretta Scott King. But because of that, then there's two elements that become important in that aspect. One, that it's the leadership of the civil rights movement was Black middle class people. Right? It comes from a group of people that were economically doing better than other Black communities, and where the injustice of segregation was felt very much. There were opportunities that they should have had access to and were being denied to them. The other thing is what Olavo was pointing out was the religious aspect. The foundation of the civil rights movement is in a Southern Baptist tradition. And we see elements of it in Martin Luther King's speeches. He's very religious, talks about religion a lot in his speeches, but even the way he talked resembled the way preachers would preach to the congregations in the South. There was a lot of call and response. There was a kind of tone and way in which they spoke. And all the organizing that was done in the South was organized around church communities. You would hear about a demonstration, about a sit-in, about a protest through your church. So all the organizing was through churches, right? The beginning of the civil rights movement really begins with the Montgomery bus boycott. Right, which is the story of Rosa Parks. And the story we all know is that on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks takes a bus after a long day of work, and she is asked to give up her seat for a white bus customer, and she refuses. She refuses to give up her seat. At the time in Montgomery, you had to, Black customers were only allowed to use the back of the bus. And if there was more white passengers that needed that seats, they were supposed to give up their seats for the white passengers. And Rosa Parks refused to. She is arrested and ends up going to jail for the crime of not giving up her seat. So around this, then the NAACP at the time was looking for a test case to challenge bus segregation in Montgomery. Montgomery was notorious for being a very heavily segregated city, and so this needed to be challenged legally. So Rosa Parks becomes the case they used to challenge it. There is a little bit more to the story. Rosa Parks was the secretary at the NAACP. So she was not just some nobody taking the bus. She was somebody who was actively involved already with the NAACP, knew her rights, knew what she was doing. So this was an action that she knew was political. It was also not the first time she had done this. She had done it several other times, but this was kind of the right time and the right person to really challenge this, the segregation of public transportation in Montgomery. It's also the right time because they needed new leadership. Most of the Black leadership in Montgomery at the time had been around for a long time. And so everybody had like skeletons in their closet. They had enemies they'd already made amongst the local community. And so they were looking for somebody new, a fresh face that could be the face of the bus boycott. And it turns out Martin Luther King had recently returned to the South, and he was getting involved with the NAACP and the movement down there. And he ends up being the right person at the right time, right? As part of his the speeches he ends up giving at the time, he says this, right? Quote, "We have no alternative but to protest. For many years, we have shown an amazing patience. We have sometimes given our white brothers the feeling that we liked the way we were being treated. But we come here tonight to be saved from that patience that makes us patient with anything less than freedom and justice." So a few things here. One, what he was doing and what he was saying was radical. So radical, in fact, that initially at the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, most people were against the boycott and they were against Martin Luther King Jr. People saw him as too radical. The whole time he's preaching nonviolent direct action, right? He's saying, we're not going to be violent. This is a boycott. So Black people all over Montgomery were not using public transportation, right, to force the hand of the city to change their segregation law. And so they had to provide alternatives for people. They had to organize people giving each other rights, helping each other out, because Black people made up the majority of public transportation users in Montgomery. So they knew that if they could hold out on the boycott, that they would financially hurt the city and force it to end segregation. It ends up being successful. But it's important to remember that the initial reaction of most of the country was, whoa, this is too radical. For many people, even people who believed that segregation was wrong, felt that you couldn't just demand desegregation and that it occur immediately. And that's what Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement was asking. They were asking that segregation end and that it end immediately. Right? Now, a couple of political aspects here, right? The case that we know is that of Rosa Parks, but there's a lot of politics behind why that became the case that gets used. And it falls under the category of the politics of respectability, right? That in order to make a case to the nation, because the NAACP and Martin Luther King Jr. knew that they wanted this to be not just a local issue in Montgomery, they wanted it to be a national issue so that then they could begin tackling segregation everywhere. So this would be a kind of domino effect where all the segregation laws would begin tumbling down. So like I said before, they'd been looking for a test case. Initially, they thought they had their case with the case of Claudette Colvin. Right? Claudette Colvin was a 15-year-old girl in Montgomery, Alabama. And she, like others, refused to give up her seat on a bus. Right? She knew what she was doing. This was a political action. It was intentional again. People who refused to give up their seat knew that this was against the law, and they were actively challenging it when they were refusing to give up their seat. So the NAACP hears about this. They initially think, okay, this is the case we're going to use to challenge the law in the courtroom. And then they find out that Claudette Colvin was pregnant. Why could the NAACP not use her case?
Oh,
Because she
know.
was
I know.
pregnant. Do you want to say?
I know. Because first of all, she was teenager. Second, because her is different from the black people. I said, oh my God, this is so crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, it fed all like the bad stereotypes of the black teen pregnant girl.
Yeah.
So they knew that if they used her case to challenge the law, when the country would find out about her, they would immediately be like, she's a black pregnant teen, and they would immediately ignore her case.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what happens time and again when we ask people, right? When we hear about a case happening of some injustice somewhere, most of us, the first thing we want to know is we want to know more information, especially we want to know more information on the supposed victim. Are they really a victim? I'm like, it's a kind of curiosity. We want to know more because if we're all going to weigh in and have an opinion, we want to make sure that we're going to be championing the right person. Because of our own stereotypes, then sometimes we have negative attitudes about people. And the NAACP was very aware of that. And they were aware that they could not use her. In contrast, Rosa Parks was an older woman, a pillar of the community, well known. There was nothing in her background that people could use against her. And so they went with Rosa Parks rather than Claudette Colvin for it. But it's a reminder that sometimes we ask too much of people. We ask them to be perfect. When, like, what does her pregnancy have to do with the segregation in Montgomery buses? Nothing. Her pregnancy potentially might even be an asset to the case because, hello, here's this pregnant girl. Why shouldn't she have a seat? But no, she would be judged too harshly, especially by the white community in the United States. And the NAACP was very aware that in order to end segregation, they needed not just the full backing of the Black community, but particularly they needed enough white people on their side. She's still alive, Claudette Colvin, and she has said of this. She said, "I could not move because history had me glued to the seat. It felt like Sojourner Truth's hands were pushing me down on one shoulder and Harriet Tubman's hands were pushing me down on another shoulder, and I could not move." And this is typical of a lot of civil rights activists. They understood the meaning of what they were doing and how historically important it was. Like, they knew they were challenging the law and that it was important to do so. You had to be committed because you were risking going to jail. You were risking bodily harm. People could harm you. They could use violence against you for standing up to an unfair law. So the tools of the civil rights movement did risk violence, even though the tactics were nonviolent, right? Claudette Colvin, Rosa Parks were not using violence to make their point. They were just refusing to obey the law. But in refusing to obey the law, they were doing something radical, right? So nonviolence tactics don't mean there is no violence. It just means that the person protesting is not the one doing the violence, right? So sit-ins become a popular tactic for the civil rights movement, right? And so what that involved was, for example, like at the bus, refusing to move or blatantly sitting in the white section of the bus, right? Same thing at like lunch counters. This becomes a popular tactic of desegregating like restaurants and places where you would go eat. Typically, Black people could not sit at the counter. You could order at the counter, and then the service people would give you your food and you to go. You're supposed to go. So the way people challenged those laws was by sitting, going up to a lunch counter, ordering your food, and then refusing to move when you were being told to leave, right? And this turned out to be a really effective tactic, so effective that people began using it all over the world to challenge the status quo. People in Poland were using it to protest Soviet laws. They were using it in Japan, in South Africa to challenge apartheid, in Mexico, and the songs, the chants of the civil rights movement end up having a global impact. Right? People all over the world were watching what was happening in the United States, and when a tactic was working, it would get imported all over the world. Right? So it was effective. Nonviolent direct action, things like sit-ins, were very effective to challenge segregation laws in the United States. Right? Now, they did involve violence, right? Because what was the reaction of white communities and white law enforcement to people sitting in? You all know this. How did people react? I know you all know this because it's the most famous images of the civil rights movement show the violence against protesters. But people were, oh, someone's putting in the chat. With force, yeah. I mean, at a smaller level, which was not small, but people would be screaming at people during the sit-ins. They would be throwing things at them, food, other things. They ended up with wounds. When it got really bad, the police would be called in, and the police would try to physically remove people from these establishments, which often meant like treating them violently, hurting them. The police would use police dogs to attack protesters. They used the high pressure water hoses that were like burning and hurting people. They were physically just hitting them to the point where protesters using nonviolent tactics would die. There were hundreds of people all over the South during the civil rights movement that died because of the violence used by the police in some of these places against them. Okay. However, those images, the nonviolent protests, worked in part because they highlighted the injustice. When the American public in general would see this, right? When they would see the police using dogs and high pressure water hoses against somebody who was just sitting in the counter, it makes it very clear, this is not fair. Like, this person is just sitting. Yeah, they're protesting. What they're doing is against the law. But clearly, when you see that, it's an unfair law. Why can't the person sit? Just because they're Black? Just because of the color of their skin? They can't sit and pay for food? Right? And this is how the civil rights movement ends up changing public opinion, right? And getting a majority of the American public. By the time we get to 1965 and 1967, the majority of the American public favored federal legislation that would put an end to segregation, right? Because oftentimes the NAACP would be successful, right? They took cases all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would rule that separate was not equal, that it was illegal to have separate facilities, separate schools, separate hospitals, all of this separate but equal. The Supreme Court was finally, thanks to the NAACP, ruling that was illegal. So, okay, if it's illegal, you don't have to follow these laws. Well, locally in places like Montgomery, people refused to listen to obey the law, the new law, right? The Supreme Court just said this is illegal. But locally, nothing changed until protesters would come in and challenge the local community and basically force them to accept the rulings of the Supreme Court. Even then, sometimes you couldn't force people, right? Sometimes, like in the case of desegregating schools, students that initially desegregated schools in places like Montgomery or in Mississippi, for example, there was a lot of backlash to the civil rights movement. It wasn't allowed. Things didn't change until the federal government stepped in. The government had to send in the National Guards. They would have to take over the state National Guard and protect the handful of students that would desegregate a school. So it was, we like to, we acknowledge now that segregation is unfair, that, not just illegal, but wrong. But people at the time, especially white people, did not believe that it was wrong. And they fought very hard to maintain the segregation laws. There was also freedom rides, usually organized by students. There was the organization was SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I'll talk about them more later, but they organized college students, usually from the North. It was students, white and Black students, and any background, to come to the South during the summer, right, while they're on school break, to help desegregate certain places. Because in some towns, right, in the American South, Black people would make up a minority of the population. So how do you force those towns to desegregate? Well, it would take activists coming in and forcing those towns, the police and the elected officials force their hand on this, right? So these freedom rides that were organized would be putting people on buses and challenging these laws, right? Sitting in the wrong place. So the Black students and activists would sit in the white section, and the white students and activists would sit in the Black section. Would use the wrong restrooms at each bus stop. And it was intentional. They were trying to provoke people in order to highlight the injustice of the segregation laws. As a result, though, and especially as these freedom riders became more like, they got more attention from the media, people would wait for them. They knew where they were going to be going, where they would be stopping along the way. And white protesters, counter protesters, would be waiting for them at a bus stop and would be not just yelling at them, throwing stuff, violently attacking the freedom riders. And it ends up creating a crisis in the moment, because the freedom riders didn't stop. They were like, nope, we're not going to stop. The protesters were getting killed at times in some of these places. And so the public, the American public in general, felt like, hey, we can't just let these kids, these students, get killed all over the place. Like, they should be protected. But the Kennedy administration at the time, this is a time of JFK, didn't want to get involved. They were deeply, even though they supported the civil rights movement, they didn't want to lose the white Southern vote. So they were very careful and wanted to limit the actions of the federal government. Right? So it got so bad in these summers in the 1960s that the Kennedy administration actually asked activists to please stop. They called up Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders and said, you need to stop these demonstrations, because we can't send in anyone to protect them, and they're going to keep getting attacked. But the protesters didn't stop. right? I mean, at that point, even though Martin Luther King was the leader, he wasn't organizing all of these. Students felt like it was their duty to help desegregate. James Farmer, who was one of the creators of the Freedom Rider ride tactic, he said, quote, "We felt that we could count on the racists of the South to create a crisis so that the federal government would be compelled to enforce the law." And that's one of the keys, is that activists knew that nothing would change in some of these places until they were forced. Not, and the local government would not do anything. Local law enforcement would not do anything to change it. The governors, the states, would not do anything to change things, that it would take federal action to do it. And so they were demanding that the federal government step in, right? And they were actively doing it. They knew they were going to get attacked, right? They knew they were going to get arrested. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested multiple times for demonstrations that were not violent, right? What the Freedom Riders were doing was not violent, but they knew, they were expecting that there would be a violent reaction and that the cameras would catch it, that there would be newspapers and TV cameras there at the bus stops, at every location, and that people would be able to see how white Southerners were violently attacking nonviolent protesters. Right. So they knew what they were doing, right? This was not an accident. It was a very strategic tactic that they were using, because they knew that ultimately they had to make their case to the entire country in order to force the federal government to step in and do something. This also made the civil rights activists heroes all over the world, right? Heroes all over the world. Martin Luther King Jr. ends up winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And so this was something that that becomes a really important way for a minority group to challenge a majority and its unfair laws. Right? In 1963, right, it's estimated that there were somewhere around 930 civil rights demonstrations all over the American South. Somewhere around 20,000 people were arrested during those demonstrations. And this was just 1 year, right? Just 1963. And so it had to take a lot of courage for people to be willing to take part. But okay, a lot of nonviolent direct action, these tactics, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, were working to desegregate the South, to change these laws. At the same time, though, people were seeing the violence with which activists, nonviolent activists, were being forced to endure. And some people didn't think that nonviolent tactics were the answer. They were looking at this and they're saying, okay, how can we make that work in Chicago, in New York, in Los Angeles, where there was no specific law that prohibited Black people from doing things, but there was still a large amount of racism. How? So how are you supposed to fight racism in places in like the North and the West and big cities where there was no segregation, no legal segregation, but racism and inequality existed? Well, the answer for a lot of, especially young Black people, was, okay, that means responding with violence, right? And so the Black Power movement is born, right? And it symbolized a significant change within the civil rights activists. And even you can see it even in the language of the time. It was very common. I mean, when you read Martin Luther King Jr. or any other civil rights leader at the time, they were using the word Negro to talk about Black people. That begins changing in the 60s. As the Black Power movement grows, they change the vocabulary. So it's no longer correct to call Black people Negro. Instead, the new word would be Black, right? And they were emphasizing that Blackness was not a bad thing, that Blackness was great, that Black people were beautiful, and that they shouldn't be ashamed of the color of their skin, and that they deserved education, access to health care, access to affordable housing, right? This is as desegregation is ending, right? But the civil rights movement was producing significant change in the South. But as the focus begins to shift to the kind of inequality that existed in cities, especially in northern cities, the tactics and the approach by activists in cities changes, because to them, nonviolence was not working in the cities, right? And they didn't speak to the concerns that they were facing. Now, the phrase Black Power was popularized by Stokely Carmichael. He gets his beginnings within the nonviolent civil rights movement, and he becomes the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And SNCC was responsible for the organizing of a lot of college students, especially. The freedom rides, SNCC was a big part of. The sit-ins were started by SNCC. Then they participated in a lot of the marches and the demonstrations as well. But Stokely Carmichael takes over the leadership of SNCC, and he begins emphasizing that we should be fighting segregationists with the same things they're attacking us with, he would say. Right? He would say, hey, if you're shouting at me, I'm going to shout back at you. If you are violently attacking me, then I will defend myself by hitting you as well. He says, we don't have to just sit back and take the abuse. Right? Now, for nonviolent tactics, right, for Martin Luther King, in order for nonviolent tactics to work, you need to not respond. You need to sit there and just accept the abuse, accept the violence. You cannot respond back, right? Because you're making a case to the cameras, to the larger audience. And Stokely Carmichael was saying, no. To me and to people that joined the Black Power movement, they said, no, if you hit me, I will hit you back. Right? Now, they were not asking Black people to abuse white people out of nowhere, right? What they were promoting was self-defense. But how do you think the American public reacts to the Black Power movement? Does the American public look at the Black Power movement and say, yes, this is great, we support you? Yes or no? Here we go in the chat. No, they see it as a threat. Yeah, they see the Black Power movement as way too radical, right? This actually contributes to making Martin Luther King Jr. look more reasonable. A lot of people saw Martin Luther King Jr. as too radical, like he was too radical for a lot of people. But then in contrast to the Black Power movement, he was extremely reasonable. But for a lot of white Americans, this was a threat. All they heard was Black people are going to start using violence against white people. Right? They didn't hear the self-defense part. They were hearing just the violent part. But for a lot of especially young Black people, the Black Power movement was finally like listening to them and to their concerns. They were talking not just about desegregation, they were talking about poverty, which was this huge concern in Black communities. And a lot of poor Black people felt like Martin Luther King Jr. was not speaking to them. Because initially he wasn't talking about all of those issues, and he wasn't talking, they felt like he's talking to other educated middle class Black people. He's not talking to poor Black people. Whereas the Black Power movement came usually from that background. They had been born and raised in cities, especially in the North, and they understood the problems that Black people were encountering in cities, the problem of poverty, the problem of lack of good housing, being discriminated in the job market. Right? So the Black unemployment rate was high at the time, and a lot of it was due to discriminatory practices in hiring, where a Black person, even if they had the credentials and a lot of the experience, would not get the job if there was a white candidate. Very common, and we're talking about not just in the South, all over the country, right? And they were talking about lack of access to healthcare, about lack of access to schooling. So the schools might not have been segregated everywhere, but Black people still could not access decent schools. A lot of the schools in Black neighborhoods were not very good. And they were usually like to the point where some people explicitly would talk about how, oh no, for schools in Black neighborhoods, we're not going to hire the most educated people. Like, we're just going to hire someone to come in and do a subpar job. So they weren't even trying to provide good schooling to schools that where Black communities were located. And so this was something that they felt like the Black Power movement was finally addressing in a way that Martin Luther King Jr. had not been. But yeah, it scared a lot of white Americans, right? The way Carmichael put it, Stokely Carmichael was, we're fighting segregation with segregation. Fine, you don't want us? Fine. What we're going to do is work within the Black community and make our schools better. We need to organize our community to provide some sort of basic health care. We need to organize ourselves to make our communities better. Right. And so Stokely Carmichael ends up turning SNCC into a Black Power organization. Right. After Stokely Carmichael, Hubert Rapp Brown replaces him as the leader of it. And this was in 1967. There was bloody riots in Chicago, in New York. The Watts riots had occurred in LA already. Like, there were rioting that was happening all over the country. Usually a lot of those demonstrations and riots began with police violence against unarmed Black men. Usually it would end in a death, and then people would try to protest that violence, and as the protesters were getting attacked, then the whole thing, people lost control of the demonstration, and then violence and rioting just ended up dominating in a lot of these occasions. And at a press conference, Brown said, and he was very direct about it, right? He said, quote, "I say you better get a gun. Violence is necessary. It is as American as cherry pie." Right? So that police violence was another major concern of the Black Power movement, because this was one of the recurring issues in cities, was that the majority of the police force was white. And they were oftentimes over policing Black neighborhoods. They would go in, pull over um, a Black motorist, someone driving a car, and it would end in a violent confrontation where the Black motorist would be hurt or killed. And in the Black community, this was well known. This was well known that this was a problem. And so what the Black Power movement was saying is, okay, well, how do you respond to that? How do you non-violently respond to police violence? For them, you couldn't. Nonviolence was not working. They'd already tried that. Right? What a lot of the Black Power movement was saying was, okay, you're supposed to not talk back to the cop, do what they say. But a lot of times for Black communities, they felt like you do that and you still end up getting beat up. You still end up getting hurt and potentially killed. So then what are we supposed to do? Well, we're going to fight back, was what Black Power movement was saying. Now, notice how a lot of those issues have come up again, right? It's a lot of the same kind of issues that come up when we look at police violence, issues of police violence today. When you look at Black Lives Matter and what the organizational issues are, it's the same, right? Not everything's exactly the same, right? Like one of the big changes has been the racial and ethnic demographics of police forces. At the time, in the 1960s and 70s, a majority of the police force was white, and racism was okay, right? And so these issues were really speaking to the issues that were occurring in northern cities, right, in a way that the civil rights movement had not been doing before. So amongst the heroes or the leadership that the Black Power movement was looking to was not Martin Luther King Jr. It was people like Malcolm X, right? Che Guevara. The Cuban Revolution had already occurred, and Che Guevara was a hero to a lot of young people all over the world, but especially to young people, young Black people in the United States, because he was criticizing the American government and its racism just openly to its face, right? Che Guevara, this is after the Cuban Revolution, comes as a representative of Cuba to New York to a UN assembly, and he criticizes the US to their faces at that. And for young people, they were like, yes, exactly. That's exactly what we've been saying, what we've been feeling. Same thing with Malcolm X, right? He was talking about self-defense as well, and so these are the people that the Black Power movement, this new generation of activists, was being inspired by. So okay, that brings us to Malcolm X, right? Because oftentimes these two men, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, get discussed as like polar opposites. And in some ways, at the beginning of their activism, they stood on opposite ends of what they felt needed to be done, right? And they spoke very differently, right? Now, we tend to not learn a ton about Malcolm X. There's no holiday celebrating Malcolm X, even though he was a very important leader at the time. So let me ask you all, what do you all know about Malcolm X? Do we know nothing?
I'm quiet.
Olavo knows everything because Olavo has read the autobiography of Malcolm X and just turned in an essay on it.
I'm quiet.
So let me ask the rest of you, what do you know about Malcolm X? Has anybody else read the autobiography of Malcolm X? He was not part of the Black Panthers. He is not a member of the Black Panther Party, but the Black Panther Party comes out of a lot of what the Black Power movement, what Malcolm X was advocating for. So he is very important to the Black Panthers, but he was not a member of the Black Panther Party. Alex, no, that's okay. I'm like, the fact that you associate with the Black Panthers is good. That is correct. But see, I'm like, this is the thing we don't learn enough about other leaders of the civil rights movement. And he is a really interesting, anyone that's interested in activism, I think needs to read Malcolm X. If you are, well, like if you pay attention to a lot of issues about race and inequality, a lot of what he talks about is not going to be new to you, but he was one of the first people to be openly talking about some of these things. But he actually had a very similar background to that of Martin Luther King Jr., except that he was raised in northern cities. Most of his life he's living in northern cities, not in the South. But his father had been a Baptist minister, except his father had a lot of experience with the KKK. His house, the family home, had been burnt down. His father was murdered when he was young, and so he was really raised by his widowed mother, who had a lot of mental health issues and ends up being put in a mental health institution. So that really colored his experience. He ends up like moving to Boston and then to New York, and ends up being jailed for burglary. He talks about like he talks about how he was a criminal, right, in his autobiography. In prison, he discovers the Nation of Islam, right? And the Nation of Islam at the time was being led by Elijah Muhammad. It was a religious organization based primarily out of Chicago, but they were advocating for Black nationalism and Black separation. They did not believe in integration. Right? They believed no, segregation is fine. And they believed that white people could never live with Black people in harmony. And so the solution then was for Black people to live separately than white people. In fact, the goal of the Nation of Islam was for Black people to own their own land and to form their own separate government. They even at one point reached out to the KKK to work together on this. Kind of really bizarre, but because they both believed in segregation. But also a lot of the message was also economic. They believed that Black communities should be self-sufficient, that Black people should only shop at Black-owned stores, they should eat at Black-owned restaurants, that you should not be giving your money to white people, that everything should stay within the Black community. This resonated with a lot of people in cities, especially because in a lot of Black neighborhoods, when you looked at who owned the stores, the grocery stores, the restaurants, all of the businesses in Black communities tended to not be owned by Black people. Right? This was true all over the country, right? One, because local governments would make it very difficult for Black families, Black entrepreneurs to qualify for business loans. And oftentimes, even when they did qualify, they would just be like racism would lead to Black people being denied loans for businesses. And so that aspect of the Nation of Islam's message resonated with a lot of people. Now, religion was a big part of it. So, you know, the Nation of Islam still emphasized like not eating pork, not drinking alcohol, not doing drugs. And that was clearly something that Malcolm X really needed at the time, and that resonated with him and with a lot of formerly incarcerated people. So the Nation of Islam actually did a lot of recruitment in prisons, which was one of the ways in which Malcolm X encountered them. So he ends up joining the Nation of Islam after he leaves prison and becomes, it turns out he had a lot of skill as a speaker. And so he ends up being a major part of the Nation of Islam. And in fact, at the time that Malcolm X joined the Nation of Islam, it was a small organization. It was not a religious movement. It was just a tiny thing. And Malcolm X ends up putting the Nation of Islam on a national level. He helps grow the organization. And because of his speeches were so controversial, he ends up getting a lot of publicity for the Nation of Islam. But and so amongst the things that Malcolm X said, that are very well known, is his speech by any means necessary. Now, in it, he was talking about Black people defending themselves by any means necessary. But that quote of "by any means necessary" is the one that gets played on televisions all over the US, and it sounds like this Black man is advocating for violence. Right. So he was very heavily criticized and disliked by the general public. Then he has a falling out with Elijah Muhammad. The Nation of Islam is a very interesting organization. Anybody wants to do more research, it still exists today, but it never is able to maintain the size that it had when Malcolm X was basically the main spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. He has a falling out with the leader, with Elijah Muhammad, and Malcolm X is kicked out, essentially. He leaves the Nation of Islam. At the same time, he makes a pilgrimage to Mecca, which is something that is required of Muslims. And for Malcolm, that was a deep religious experience. And so he remains a Muslim. And just to be clear too, the Nation of Islam is not typically recognized as mainstream, as being a part of mainstream Islam. It is a sect of Islam, and it's actually a lot of Muslim people would not recognize the Nation of Islam as true Islam, because their message is not just religious, it's also political and focused on Black people. Like, you as a white person can help the Nation of Islam, but you're not going to be, you would not be invited to join. You could not attend their private events or their religious ceremonies. But Malcolm X, this pilgrimage to Mecca really changes him a lot. And by the end of that, combined with the trip, like right after his trip to Mecca, he does a tour of Africa. He comes back really a changed man. He was speaking about Martin Luther King Jr. in very different terms, like not criticizing him, but applauding him for what he had done. And so there's a very important shift that occurs there. But he is assassinated in 1965. See, do I have time? I don't think I have time to play this clip. So we'll come back to Malcolm X on Wednesday. But I think one of the things I want to emphasize is that the public reacts very similarly, with key differences, to Black leaders during the Civil Rights Movement, right? Initially, the reaction to the Civil Rights Movement in general is negative, right? It's negative. You're asking for too much, too much, too soon. But then Martin Luther King Jr. becomes a hero, a symbol of heroism and of nonviolent tactics in the US. And so he comes to be viewed in more favorable ways, in a way that other leaders do not, right? Malcolm X is viewed as somebody who was too radical. And oftentimes people had the wrong perception of him, and other times they didn't, right? Like, he was actively asking for separation between Black and white people. He would call white people white devils oftentimes. And he said, when people would ask him, "So what can I as a white person do? I see the racism, I see the discrimination, I don't want to participate, I want to help the Black community. What can I do?" And his response was nothing, right? Whereas Martin Luther King Jr. had a direct message to white people that was, "You are my brothers. We live in the same community. We should love one another and help one another." And so that that's based on true. Then these two images of them. Martin Luther King was much more conciliatory to the white community, whereas Malcolm X said no. Right. At the same time, though, he was not advocating for just random violence against white people. He didn't want all white people to be dead or anything like that. And after Mecca, after his pilgrimage to Mecca, he totally changed on that. His view of white people changed. He begins to see how it was possible for white and Black people to work together. But at that point, he doesn't live too far after the pilgrimage to Mecca. So his life's cut short, and who knows what might have happened if that had not been the case. But this is why we learn more about one leader and not some of the others. Right. On top of it, where were all the women? I've actually perpetuated this issue of leaving women out of the civil rights movement. They were there. They were taking active part. A lot of them are left out of leadership roles, though, and not given the recognition they deserve, but women were there. Women like Fannie Lou Hamer and other women whose names we'll never know, but they did all the work of organizing people. The way that demonstrations and marches would get people to show up, to march, to demonstrate, often involved women going to church and talking to people about, there's going to be this demonstration, you need to show up, this is the time you're going to show up, we're going to have food, oh, you need childcare, let's help you get childcare. Like, it was women, Southern Baptist women, doing all the actual legwork and organizing of people, of getting people to show up to demonstrations and marches. And so I don't want to completely ignore them, even as we talk about some of these men. Olavo says, he said, "I'm a Black national separatist leader, even though I'm a Muslim leader." Yeah, I mean, I'm like, there's no, yes, he absolutely did. And so we don't want to make Malcolm X into somebody he's not. He said these things, and so and they were received, right, in a very negative way. Okay, questions, comments, concerns? I'll stop the recording.